My name is David Beasley.
My name is Bob Rennie.
My name is Doris Ann Lemon.
My name is Martha Hemphill.
And I am the great-great-great-grandson of Richard Beasley, first settler at the head of the lake, later Hamilton.
And I'm related to Henry Bostick, who's a lieutenant colonel in the 1st Oxford Militia. He was my 4 times great-grandfather.
And I am descended from Mary Titus Williams through my maternal line, and I would be the 5th great-granddaughter of Mary.
And I'm the 3rd great-granddaughter of Titus Simons.
So Richard Beasley came up to the head of the lake. Where he actually settled was he had houses down on the bay off Burlington Heights. And that's where the Governor Simcoe visited him, and Lady Simcoe did her wash drawings of the place. It's an interesting how he had enough money to build this great house on the Burlington Heights, on the height itself, overlooking the bay. And he grew vegetables and apples and pears and whatever, cherries and things like that. He was a fur trader at a very young age, and he was in Parliament as well. He was Speaker of the House, the early House. He developed the militia and this area. So when the War of 1812 came, he was the colonel of the 2nd York, and he fought in a lot of the battles for the War of 1812. Because the British officers mistrusted the Canadian settlers, he had a difficult time with them. But he was a loyalist, and in his 50s, he was fighting hand to hand. Unfortunately, in the War of 1812, General Vincent, when he was retreating the 2nd time from Niagara, decided to take over his house and make it his headquarters, and just threw them out. And so he and his family and his domestics had to find somewhere in the village to live. And they used all his fence posts, whatever he'd built up over the years. They tore them down, used them for firewood. Well, there is again bad blood between the British officer class and the Canadian officer class. When he was able to reclaim the land in 1814, it was a real mess. And we know that because of his claims on the government for restitution. Probably resented it, but after all, it was wartime. And so it was quite crowded. All these refugees coming from there, and then later on, refugees coming from Niagara. After the war was over, around 1815, a lot of people made claims on the government for the ruins that their property had been brought to. Now, he was a man of great integrity, I think, and great courage. And he was loyal, even though he suffered for this.
Henry Bostick was actually born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, but came to Canada in his teenage years after his mother had died, and he was raised in the Port Dover area and set up his business in Port Dover, known as Dover Mills at the time. Henry married a loyalist daughter, Anne Williams, and they raised their family in Port Dover, and he went off to learn to be a lawyer, and so he was one of two lawyers in the London district before the war started. He was also with the the Norfolk militia, so he was a captain with the Norfolk militia before the war started. Early in the war, Henry was appointed by General Brock directly to be a lieutenant colonel of the 1st Oxford Militia. It was very apparent early in the war that Brock needed to take an offensive action, and that was done through the attack on Detroit. But Henry Bostick was asked to take command of the land forces that were going over by land. And Henry and his forces actually got to the Detroit frontier before General Brock did. There were a number of battles that Henry was involved with throughout the war. So there is Lundy's Lane, he was involved there. He was involved in the battle at Fort Erie, one of the battles at Fort Erie. There's a number of them there. And he was most noted for the Battle of Nanticoke Creek, where a number of traitors were captured. Those traitors were taken off for the Bloody Assize trial at Ancaster. So Henry was chief witness for the prosecution at that particular trial, as he commanded the forces that captured those traitors. Interestingly enough, though, his brother-in-law was the defense lawyer, and he was the other lawyer in the London district at the time. So it was sort of a family affair. Later on, Henry commanded the last battle on Canadian soil at the Battle of Malcolm's Mills at Oakland, Ontario. And so it was a very devastating time, but Henry was written up in a recent article where he was a rock when everybody else liquefied.
Mary Williams was born of Dutch ancestry in the 13 American colonies, and during the American Revolution, her husband, Jonathan, was a captain on the British side, and then they came to Upper Canada. They were here by 1801 to Norfolk County in what was called then Dover Mills, and it is now Port Dover. He was the customs manager at the port of Turkey Point, and a farmer. He farmed, and that's how they made their living. And then when the War of 1812 happened, they were all in the militia. Jonathan and the 3 sons, Titus, John, and Elijah. And the little boys were at home. The girls were married and living out. Well, she had many small children still at home. Francis, Isaac, Henry, Horatio Nelson, and Charles were all under military age. So she would be busy with those little boys to begin with, and with the men away fighting, she would be left with the daily chores as the other women in the neighborhood would. So she would be milking the cow and feeding the chickens and doing whatever a farm wife would do with the husband and the growing boys all away. It wouldn't have been easy for her. It wouldn't have been easy. When the war broke out, Mary's life changed dramatically. Jonathan had been a captain for the British during the American Revolution. Therefore, he was still called Captain Jonathan Williams. The day in May when the Americans landed at Dover Mills, the mist was heavy over Lake Erie. And when the mist cleared mid-morning, 6 sailing ships were moored just outside the port, with smaller boats bobbing around them. Over 700 men came ashore and were raiding and pillaging. So when Mary heard that morning, she lifted the treads to the loft and put knickknacks, pewter, treasures, papers in there, and nailed the treads down for safety. When the enemy banged at the door and said, "Mrs. Williams, you have 30 minutes to collect belongings before I set torch to the house." But she said, "You're not burning." And they said, we have been instructed to burn Captain William's home. And with that, he thrust her aside, and he went and set a torch to the mattress, straw mattress. So she took the mirror off the wall and told Isaac, who is now 14, to run and hide in the ravine. She grabbed her cherry sewing stand, and that's all she had time for. And the house burned to the ground. A straw mattress in a wooden house would go in seconds. She didn't have a chance to do anything else, you know. I'm astonished she had these two things and that they have actually survived. Yeah. After it was over, after the burning that day, then she learned her daughter, Ann Nancy Bostick, her home, carriage, and all the movable property was burned, and she and her small children were also homeless. Well, if I look at my great aunts, who were her great granddaughters, I think she was sparkling and fun and capable, a bit bossy, but manageable. So she persevered. She was strong and she persevered. Yeah.
Titus Simons was born in Enfield, Connecticut in 1765. He was the son of Titus Simons, who was a United Empire Loyalist. Titus Simons fought with Burgoyne during the American Revolution, and he came to Canada via Montreal, where Titus Simons was a sheriff. He was in Montreal in 1777, and they settled in Flamborough in about 1780. He was a grist mill and lumber mill owner. He was a printer. He had the Upper Canada Gazette and American Oracle was his newspaper. He was a King's printer. And he was the first sheriff of Gore in 1816. He was a very, very civic-minded person, very involved in politics and his military career. When it came to the War of 1812, Titus Gear and his brother John Kingsley were members of the 2nd York Militia. In 1813, he was a senior officer stationed at Burlington Heights, the main supply base and hub of communication. As from the jackets, you can see that he was wounded at the Battle of Lundy's Lane. He had his arm raised to lead his men into attack, and he was shot by friendly fire. And then the family tale goes that an Indian runner was sent back to Flamborough to bring Hannah Coon Van Avery Simons to his wife to his side, and she had her little baby in her arms and made the long trek on horseback to his side. Contemporaries would probably say that he was a very proud man, a very strong conscience, very moral. He has been described as a Puritan. He had a very strong sense of what was right and wrong, and that he was a true friend. I've already documented my lineage from Titus Gear Simons, my third great-grandfather, by using primary documents. And I think this is the ultimate test now to prove that this is my great-grandfather. He fought for what he believed, and I think he was a very great man for his time.
My name is Stephen Fred Petro. I'm Technical Manager of the Lakehead University Paleo DNA Laboratory. We are located at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay. Our laboratory specializes in getting DNA from ancient degraded material. We also work on modern samples. We do human identification testing. We can determine species of biological material, whether it's animal, human, or plant. We do paternity testing and any other type of human relationship testing. We provide a sterile cotton swab because we want to use a swab that's DNA free. We're going to take that sterile cotton swab and we're going to rub it on the inside of the cheek for about 10 to 15 seconds. And what that is going to do is remove any excess cells inside your mouth that you normally just swallow. And we're going to take those cells that are collected and extract DNA from them. There's two ways of collecting DNA. One is to actually cut the material that is stained out and send that back to the lab. Or if that is not possible, what we do is try to transfer the stain off of the material onto another substrate. So in this case, we used a moistened cotton swab, rubbed that on the area, and we were hoping that the rubbing of the swab on the area would trap or transfer any DNA that was on that stain onto the swab. Then you would send the swab back to our laboratory.
My name is Roberta Seeley. I am the conservation technician with the Hamilton Civic Museums, and I've been asked to do the DNA swabbing on the Titus gear jacket because I'm trained to handle artifacts and I have a sensitivity to their needs. We want the testing to be as non-destructive as possible to the actual items, so what we will do first is take an interior swab from the coat sleeve. We're doing this to determine whether the red is color fast or not. We want to make sure that when we're taking the swab, we're actually lifting the blood stain and not the color from the jacket itself. So I'm just taking the interior swab to check for color fastness, and I'm just rubbing the swab gently over the interior of the coat. I'm going to do this for the 10 to 15 seconds recommended for the test. We're not getting any lifting of the dye, so this shouldn't cause any damage to the artifact. So this is where he was shot in the arm, and you can see the discoloration in this area, so we're going to take a swab from around there.
Once we receive the swab at our laboratory, it's taken to a special area of our lab. We call it clean lab. And we extract the DNA, purify it, isolate it, and then we target the specific mitochondrial DNA in terms of generating a profile. And hopefully when we compare the profile of the modern reference sample and the profile for the blood stain, you would either have a match or a mismatch.
I was in grade 6 at the Central Public School on Hunter Street, an old school that my grandfather had gone to and so on. And it was in a local history class. I had been a rather poor student, indifferent student, and I heard this name, Richard Beasley, for the first time, about the settler, and that started my interest in history. So I was aware of Richard Beasley, but All we really knew was that he was a fur trader, wasn't much else. I was interested in him, and whenever I'd come up to Canada on a vacation or something, I would look in the archives, see what I could find.
As a matter of fact, yeah, I came to the knowledge of Henry Bostick rather late in my own life. So I knew that I had relatives in the War of 1812. I had relatives that founded Port Dover. I knew about the burning of Port Dover because I was raised in Port Dover myself up until I left when I was about 20 years old. But I didn't have any direct family history about Henry. And it was actually a distant cousin of mine that mentioned Henry to me. So I started doing research and found out all sorts of wonderful things about him.
I first learned about Mary's story in 1978. My son Tom, who was with Parks Canada, stationed in Niagara-on-the-Lake, said to me, "Mom, we've always been told we have a Loyalist ancestor. Why don't you prove it for 1983? Or prove it's a myth and we'll forget it." I said, "Okay, I'll do that." I thought it'd take me 10 minutes. Well, I got started into it and discovered that in going back in my genealogy, it was through the women, and the name changed in every generation. I didn't know the name of the man even. So I met with my Aunt Iva, who lived in Norfolk, and we did all the cemeteries to find tombstones that might have given us a connection as to what the parentage of each woman. So I finally worked my way back and discovered his name was Jonathan Williams. And since then, by documentation, I have proved my descent in each generation by birth and marriage.
My mother got involved with the United Empire Loyalist Association here in Hamilton, and you sort of get drawn into it along with her. And my love of genealogy started there and continues to this day. I really enjoyed doing it. I started off with these publications that were in newspapers. You put together the family tree from various resources from the Archives of Ontario, the Upper Canada land petitions, and you go through all the birth, deaths, marriages, wills. The wills start to give you an idea of what their personality and character was like, how they lived. And you just want to start building up these people that, so that they're just not dates and places. You want to sort of discover who they were.
The connection of Richard Beasley to me today has made me appreciate the city of Hamilton. As far as I'm concerned, I've always wanted to be a writer, and I've written all my life. So I had this book in the back of my mind for many, many years, and I was glad that eventually it all came together and I was able to do it at this late time of my life.
I'm a resident of Kitchener now, but I was raised in Port Dover for the first 20 years of my life. I currently work as a director of risk management for Manulife Financial. I also do speaking engagements or reenactments as both General Brock or Henry Bostwick. I always tell people I get more requests for Brock because more people know about General Brock, but I prefer doing Henry Bostwick. So I don't think of myself as special because I've got these connections, but it definitely is a fantastic connection, and I love playing Henry Bostwick.
I have written 11 family history books, and I have a degree in history from the University of Waterloo in the Independent Studies. And I work at it all the time. I go to genealogy fairs. I help people trace their Loyalist ancestor. And that's how I met Bob Rennie, who is now Brock.
I grew up in Burlington. I worked for Inniskill and Wines for 10 years in Toronto in their office there. And I've also been involved as a library technician, which sort of goes along with doing the research.
I think a great deal of him. I mean, I think he was a courageous fellow. And the very fact that even under pressure, he did not go over to the American side, but stayed with the Canadian side and defended the country, I think he deserved credit for that.
I'm pretty sure I would not have been a reenactor if I didn't have this connection. And I certainly wouldn't have been a commander. Reenacting world has a subculture in its own right. And, but I figured for Henry Bostick in particular, he's my ancestor and I can play him if I want to.
It's been a journey that I have enjoyed. And met wonderful people, learned my history, and still learning my history. Yeah.
And your curiosity just keeps going, and you just want to keep developing these people and making them real.